In the spring of 1930, a document landed on the president's desk. Not a bill awaiting his signature, not yet. It was a warning. 1,028 of the nation's finest economists had signed a single, desperate plea. Do not do this. They knew, with near total unanimity, what would happen if Herbert Hoover ignored them. And they were right. What followed was not merely a policy error. It was the moment the world economy caught fire, and the man with the power to stop it chose to pour on gasoline. The year was 1928. Herbert Hoover campaigned for the presidency on a promise that seemed reasonable to millions of struggling farmers: raise tariffs on agricultural imports and shield rural America from foreign competition. It was a targeted pledge, narrow in scope, politically popular, and, in the eyes of most economists, misguided but survivable. But Hoover could not anticipate what would happen once that promise entered Congress. The United States already had some of the highest tariffs in its history under the Fordney-Macomber Act of 1922, with duties approaching 40%. Now, two Republican lawmakers, Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon, saw their moment. What began as farm relief was about to become something far more dangerous: the most sweeping protectionist legislation in American history. Once the tariff revision process began, it proved impossible to contain. Industry after industry lined up demanding their share of protection. Steelmakers, textile mills, chemical manufacturers. Each lobbyist who walked the marble corridors of the Capitol added another layer to a bill metastasizing far beyond anything Hoover had imagined. By the time the House passed it in May 1929, the bill has swollen into a monster, raising duties on more than 800 products, not just farm goods, but nearly everything America imported. And then, a disaster that should have killed the bill entirely. The stock market crashed in October 1929. Any sane reading of the moment said, do not restrict trade when the economy is already collapsing. But the bill did not die. It kept moving through committee hearings, Senate debates, log rolling, and vote trading, all while the country bled jobs. The economists began to panic. On May 30, 1930, Claire Wilcox, a Swarthmore Associate Professor of Economics, walked into the White House carrying a petition. 1,028 American economists had signed it. Irving Fisher of Yale, Frank Taussig of Harvard, Frank Graham of Princeton, Paul Douglas of Chicago. Their message was blunt. The bill would raise prices, subsidize inefficiency, and most ominously, provoke other nations to retaliate. A tariff war, they wrote, does not furnish good soil for the growth of world peace. But academics were not alone. Henry Ford spent an evening at the White House pleading with Hoover, calling the bill an economic stupidity. Thomas Lamont, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan, later recalled, I almost went down on my knees to beg Herbert Hoover to veto the asinine Hawley-Smoot tariff. Privately, Hoover agreed the bill was a mistake, and then he faced the trap that politics had laid for him. Hoover had campaigned on this. His party had spent more than a year fighting for it in Congress. Cabinet members threatened to resign if he vetoed it. If he killed the bill, he would fracture the Republican Party, alienate its leadership, and almost certainly lose the nomination in 1932. The math was brutal. Political survival versus economic catastrophe. And so, on June 17, 1930, Herbert Hoover sat down, picked up his pen, and signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law, ignoring the 1,000 economists, ignoring Henry Ford, ignoring his own advisors, ignoring his private doubts. The legislation raised the average tariff to roughly 41%, among the highest levels in American history. As deflation deepened over the next 2 years, the effective burden of those tariffs would climb even further. But the ink was barely dry before the consequences began. Hoover had not merely signed a tariff bill. He had fired the starting gun on a global trade war. The retaliation was swift and devastating. Canada, America's largest trading partner, struck first. Even before Hoover signed, Canada targeted 16 American products covering 30% of U.S. exports. In July 1930, Canadians elected R.B. Bennett on an anti-American trade platform. By September, he passed an emergency tariff. France raised duties on American automobiles by nearly 50%. Italy doubled, then tripled, duties on U.S. automobiles. Spain targeted American tires, film equipment, and sewing machines. A dozen more nations followed. American exports collapsed from $5.4 billion in 1929 to $2.1 billion by 1933, a drop of 61%. World trade contracted by 2/3 between 1929 and 1934. U.S. unemployment, already at 8% when Hoover signed, reached 16% in 1931 and 25% by 1933. Smoot-Hawley did not cause the Depression. It turned a severe recession into a global cataclysm. As the League of Nations later concluded, the American tariff was the signal for an outburst of tariff-making activity in other countries. The signal had been sent by one man, one pen, on one June afternoon. Nearly a century later, Smoot-Hawley remains the textbook example of what not to do in a moment of economic crisis. 1,028 experts spoke with one voice, and they were ignored. The bill that began as a promise to help farmers ended by helping destroy the global economy. Hoover chose party over country, political survival over sound judgment, and the world paid the price. Every trade debate since has carried the ghost of that decision. If you believe history speaks to the present, subscribe and tell us in the comments. Should a leader who ignores expert consensus be remembered as a fool or something worse?